Welcome to My Dog Ate My Book Report, a podcast where two, although this time it's actually three, weirdo 30-somethings take turns introducing each other to a formative book from childhood the other has never read. I am Ren, they, them.
I'm Brandon, he, him, and we've got our first ever special guest.
Hi, I'm Nuance, she, her, and technically I'm a 40-something. Ooh.
Oh!
Just turned 41 a week ago, basically.
I forgot about that. I saw that on the internet, and yeah, happy birthday.
Thank you.
So on all of our episodes that end in a even increment of 5, we do a special thing. So this time, it's our very first special guest, and I'm super excited about this. Another, New England person to outnumber Brandon.
East Coast is best coast. What are we supposed to say here?
I mean, I'm from the East Coast, so I'm okay with that. I just don't live there anymore.
Oh, that's right.
That's fair. Also, I want to thank you both for having me on here so I can just natter on about books, especially the ones that are so formative to who I am. So thank you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And normally here we are doing the thing where one of us hasn't read the book while the other one has, but in this case, neither Rin nor I have read this book before. So you are our guide.
Yeah, this is definitely a failing of the Maine education system.
I did actually read this as one of my school books in 3rd grade, so I'm just gonna have to agree with you. Although I don't know if it hadn't been for my 3rd grade teacher, because I think this wasn't an official book like that we read specifically for class, but in 3rd grade I think we were still having a reading time where we were just reading random books together as a class without getting graded on it. So yeah, I don't think if it wasn't for Mrs. Burns, I might never have known this either.
We haven't talked about geography since our very first introduction episode. So I think for the purpose of discussing whether or not we read this in school, I went to school in Maine. Brandon, you went to school?
I was in school in Virginia. It does not surprise me that I did not read this book in school because I was from a very white area. And though I didn't know it at the time, in retrospect, a lot of my grade schooling was very lost cause myth kind of Southern education. So yeah, not shocked that I wasn't exposed to a lot of books that dealt with some of these kinds of issues.
Fascinating. Understandable, but also fascinating. So I grew up in central Connecticut, and I'm not actually sure if we would have read this normally, but around when I started elementary school, the Hartford School District was actually very close to losing their school accreditation. And so a lot of the students that would normally go to a Hartford public school ended up getting bused to some of the surrounding towns, including my hometown. So they would go to school with us, and the vast majority of them, at least, were also Black. So I don't know if it was a school initiative to incorporate more Black history into the curriculum, or a personal teacher initiative, or if it was just something that she'd read on her own and had decided that yes, this needs to be part of our education. But the stuff you don't think about when you're a 3rd grader. But so one of those combination, or maybe even something haven't occurred to me, but we ended up reading it, and I don't know if I've run across anyone else who ever had as part of their overall childhood. Words are very good. I'm good at them.
Yeah. Have we said what the book is yet?
We haven't. Let's
It's a mystery this whole time.
Yeah.
So we asked Nuance what she would be excited to have us read, and there was actually a pretty good list of things that Nuance has read that I haven't read. So we might need to do this more. But yeah, what are we reading?
We are reading Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred D. Taylor. It's part of the Logan family series. Apparently book 3 in a direct series of 5 books and one of, I think, 9 overall that deal with the Mississippi in the South in the 1930s to 1940s.
The book spans a year in the life of Cassie Logan, a 9-year-old black girl in 1933 Mississippi, who lives with her family on her family's cotton farm. It is the year that she finally comes to understand racial tensions between the black residents of her small town and white, trying to find her place in a highly racialized society where so many people believe she is lesser because of the color of her skin. From her first introduction to outright racism in a local store, to discovering how a local white landowner schemes to claim her family's land for himself, to learning just how harshly black people can and would be punished for merely being suspected of crimes. All of this while still navigating the difficulties of school, family, and friendships that any 9-year-old might face then and now. There are definitely some content warnings to be aware of for this book. So, we've got anti-black racism in the Jim Crow South. It's prevalent throughout the whole thing and very heavy, so be mindful of that for your own mental well-being going into reading this book or listening to this episode. Mention of lynching, mention of fires, a lot of racially motivated violence, including but not limited to tar and feathering, burning, and more. And I also want to acknowledge, to Nuance specifically, thank you for coming on, and I wanted to acknowledge that introducing 2 white people to this book is an act of emotional labor.
No, you're quite welcome. Thank you for being willing to go on this journey with me. Like I said, this was a very foundational book for me in a lot of ways, and anytime I can introduce people to it, it's a good day. But anytime I can specifically introduce white people to it, because I know that it shifted a lot of what I knew or thought I knew even as a kid and continues to do so now. So, and I can only imagine kind of what it's shifted for you. And in fact, that was one of the discussion questions I posted. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, for sure. It was
A lot.
A lot. Yeah. So we did already dig a little bit into whose selection it is and the significance. You said about 3rd grade?
Yes. I was 8 years old, so it might have been 4th grade. I mean, I would bet Miss Ostapchik over Miss Burns. Miss Burns, if you're hearing this, I'm so sorry. But, like, for reals. So yes, I was 8 years old when I read this.
Do you have any strong memories of how you felt about it when you read it for the first time? And have you read it since?
I mean, I definitely read it for this podcast. I don't know if I'd read it since... Gosh, I don't know if I'd read it since middle school, but so much of it stayed with me. One thing I remember, and this is very interesting, so I was one of the few Black kids in my class, because again, it was me and the kids from Project Concern and maybe like 1 or 2 others. So there were very few of us in the in each classroom itself. And I remember feeling a little almost put on the spot, because it is a very odd feeling to be one of the few Black or brown faces in a room when you are reading about such a highly racialized topic. And there is kind of an unspoken expectation that not only will this mean more to you, but maybe you should also be more grounded in it. And so it was a very weird time to be reading this book, and a very weird, unspoken social interaction while we were reading it. As for reading it as a child, like, I definitely, especially when Cassie is dealing with her younger brothers, because I had a younger brother, so I was able to kind of identify with her on that. But there was a whole lot of this book that I couldn't identify with at that time, because our lives were so different. And I had also not yet quite had that kind of racial come to Jesus moment. There had been several times where I had faced, racial slurs and gotten to fights on the back of the bus and all of that. But I hadn't yet had that strict wake-up call. And part of that might be also because, I'm a light-skinned mixed race Black woman. So things were a little slower to kind of unfold for me socially. Not everybody knew I was Black immediately upon looking at me, especially not kids. So again, by the time I really got to that point, I was older than Cassie was. So a lot of this, it was meaningful, it was hurtful. I found a lot of my family in the familial interactions, but the greater societal ones, I didn't yet grok on an emotional level then. That came later, and then when it came later, it was a sucker punch, let me tell you. So that's kind of where I was.
Gosh, I can only imagine that. It definitely, realizing that she was sort of coming to terms with that part of the way through the book, it took a second, because me going into it, I sort of knew that a lot of these interactions were racially motivated, and it took me a little while to realize that she was just sort of viewing some of this stuff as, oh, that person's just a jerk, not that the whole world is potentially a jerk.
Yeah.
And that was very, very impactful.
I was going to say, I can't imagine having anything resembling the emotional intelligence to appreciate any of this in third grade. But yeah, this was definitely a really powerful read. I did not encounter books that dealt with race to this degree until high school. And so it definitely kind of took me back to that period in my life more so, when I also had a little bit more of the historical context and the reality. Because elementary school and middle school in Virginia when I was growing up, like I said, was very, very lost cause myth about things. And it wasn't until I got to high school that like some of my teachers would say, look, the standardized testing is going to ask what the Civil War was about, and it's going to expect you to bubble in states' rights. And that's not true, but that's what you need to put on the test because that's what the test wants.
Oof.
But, in elementary school, I just kind of had a very, like, slavery was bad, but it's over now. Yay. Kind of perspective. I also, I think my whole grade had 2 or 3 black kids, I want to say, out of 70 or 80 students. So very, very white area. And we just didn't really go there. And there was never really any reason for anybody to challenge like what was being taught to us, or what we're being exposed to. And I don't recall reading any books that either as assigned reading or on my own that dealt with the difficulties of the history of race relations in the U.S. and the generational trauma that goes with everything. That was stuff I didn't encounter till high school, at least.
I a similar upbringing. I was raised in rural Maine, and similarly, I don't remember reading any books that even contained black characters until books that I read on my own. And I know that I read I think probably the first book was one of the American Girl books. Addie, I think, was the character that was introduced. And that was something that I read on my own because I was kind of obsessed with those books in terms of just eating up anything historical that I could find. When it came to not school, my mom was very liberal, but also sort of like liberal in that way where she took in a lot of media that was like, yes, this is about black people or relations with other folks, but it centers white people and how heroic they can be when they're such good allies. And I remember a movie that she watched a lot was like Fried Green Tomatoes. But that has just a lot of, like, I like that movie. I think it's cute, but that has a lot of, like, look how good these white people are in this movie because they're not assholes to the black people. And it's not really, like, about the black people. They're just kind of a prop for how wholesome and good the 2 white ladies are. So I had a lot of, like, that media in my life, but nothing that really, like, centered the experience like this. And I kind of wish that I had this or knew that this existed. And I know the first thing I ever had to read for school that had anything to do with race relations or the black experience was, I think it was like junior year of high school. I had to read A Raisin in the Sun.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing I ever was assigned. And I thought going into this that maybe this was just like a failing of the rural Maine school system, but I think this is just a failing of the school system in general. Possibly
Yeah,
by design. Probably by design.
and if not deliberate design, which I would not put it past to be deliberate design, just the kind of, I don't see why it would be a problem. Everything seems fine, just that kind of benevolent neglect that
Mm.
also very much plagues our school systems.
That all being said, I have several notes in my phone about how, in all caps, Mama is amazing. She's like
Very
a
true.
superhero. I loved her. My favorite characters in this book were Mama and Little Man. Because Little Man was just feisty and always running out the door with the bigger kids, but also really just wanted to stay tidy. And I really liked him a lot.
Yeah, Little Man's great. He's the best.
And through Little Man, we get that first real introduction to systemic racism. Because I mean, there's the bit with the bus and how it tries to attack them, but that could sort of just be like one bus driver who really sucks. Slight aside, do we get to swear?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, okay. In that case, yeah, that could just be one bus driver who is a racist asshole. And you have that they don't have buses, but a lot of that, it could still really be just chalked up to poverty because they're talking about the not wearing shoes to school except on the first day, and how they're all in their Sunday clothes, and even those are a lot like faded and patched. So it's what you have is a book at that, like, for those first few chapters that could technically be about any poor family in the South who, with just this addition of this one racist asshole bus driver. It's not until we get to the school, not even, I mean, with the school again, we have the signs of poverty and not really being supported. But it's not till we see Little Man throw his book on the ground after all this excitement about getting books, because this is the first time. But you see him you see him first complain that it's dirty, and then you see him throw it on the ground and say, "I don't want it." And there, when Cassie finally opens up her book and you see the various conditions, and it's just like new, white, excellent, white, all the way down to poor, and only that is when it gets passed over to, and next to it has the word Nigra, Nigra. And that's the first time Cassie and Little Man have heard that word, especially as to describe themselves. And just looking at the dates, you can see that this textbook is at least 12 years out of date, because the first time it was issued was September of 1922. And it's not until September of 33, so 11 years, when the condition is very poor, does it move from the white school system and is given over by the county to the black. And this, again, is the first time that they have had books in their classroom. So it's through Little Man and his compulsion towards tidiness that we actually start to realize that, no, this isn't just a case of a poor district or a poor group of families. This is something that is systemic, going through the entirety of the school system. And that's when we start talking about how their school year is from October to March, because the kids have to get out and start helping in the fields, and how a lot of the kids stop going to school after 4th grade. And then when we compare that to the Jefferson Davis, where they have the normal school year that goes till May, and they are expected to go up through high school, and it is just how incredibly different that their lives are, even though their schools are just a few miles. Like, the kids have to pass the Jefferson Davis school on the way to their own. So these schools are separated by maybe a few miles at best, but societally, it's, like the opposite sides of the Grand Canyon.
The thing that stuck out to me the most about the book thing was, and I know that in 3rd grade I would not have had the vocabulary to know that this was a microaggression. When it says race of student, when the student is white, it's capitalized. But then when it goes to the black students, it's no longer capitalized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that might have been something I picked up this first reading too. Like, hey, wait a minute. But yeah, that is one of the reasons that I do like Little Man, because you do see his attempts and his obsession to keep clean in, again, a society that consistently tries to make them dirty in both physical and emotional and how they think of them. I mean, because in this time and going up for many decades after, like I know there was a soap commercial, a soap advertisement that featured a little black child trying to scrub themselves clean and therefore white with soap. Like,
Oh
that's
my
a
God.
very frequent theme in a lot of these advertisements. And so in that character of Little Man, you have a full repudiation of that, but you still have to deal with all of society trying to tell him otherwise.
Yeah, this is the part of the book too where I wrote the first "Mama is amazing" in all caps, because she goes and covers with paper the parts of the books that list out the previous students, and just took her kid's side on that, and I just thought that was great.
Yeah, I love Mama.
I really liked that victory, so to speak. It doesn't plan out all great by the end, but I thought Mama and to a lesser degree like Papa as well when he's around. Those moments where they try to do their best to raise their children in this world that the children don't entirely understand how it's going to react to them as they get older. I thought that those moments were both like in the moment a little bit cathartic, but also heartbreaking, knowing that like that's sort of small compared to the amount stacked against them and the amount of injustices they suffer in the book and implicitly will continue to suffer, right?
Oh gosh, the fact that you called it a victory just really highlights that later Mama gets fired for ostensibly what she did to the books, but really it's about her probably I'm trying to find the right words for this. Like, I feel like any small attempt they make to just let themselves have some humanity in this society just gets stomped on.
Yep. Mr. Granger puts like a gloss, like, I'm doing it for the school system. You've defaced school property. You're not teaching the Mississippi curriculum. But, it is very blatant that it's just, you have crossed me. And so now I'm going to continue to make life incredibly difficult for you. And also, I know you need money. I want your land. So this is just like a win-win-win for me. I hate Mr. Granger so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ugh,
He's
gross.
awful.
I did want to say this moves into a section of the book where they have a small victory over the school bus, which is always trying to run them off the road. And they with some intelligent sneak outing of Stacy, the oldest brother, they shovel some holes in the road when it's raining, because they know that'll end up washing it out into something more significant, and the bus falls in and breaks down. But then they feel so bad about it. And I wrote a note that I wish the characters didn't feel bad for actions that were completely justifiable.
Yeah, no.
I wish they could allow themselves to be happy that happened.
The thing that struck me was not them feeling bad, it was the fear that they had later, because they had just started learning about the Nightmen and
Right.
what happens. And that fear of such brutal retaliation. And here we're going to start talking about like all the really horrible triggery stuff, folks. So just be aware. But like, because they just learned that the men had been, that several of the men that they know had been taken out and literally set on fire for the audacity of being accused of winking at a white woman, which, that's almost a direct callback to Emmett Till and all of that. Mm-hmm. So, they're starting to finally really learn that this world is not safe for them. And when they do, as you said earlier, like do things to assert their humanity and pick themselves up and retaliate against white society for the literal harm that they do, they will be punished immediately and swiftly and in absolutely horrific ways. So, and it didn't hit me that hard when I was first reading it as a kid. Like, I didn't know what the Nightmen were. I mean, you learn about it in the book, but I didn't immediately put it towards like, oh, this is the KKK. This is danger and fear. You know, this is something that hangs over their lives. So for them to actually start seeing that and realizing that this could happen to them, which is then later backed up by Mr. Morrison's story, who had also been burned. And he's talking about how this happened when he was 6. And, you know, his mother went in to get his little sisters, and none of them ever came out. He was the only survivor. So they're even right to be afraid because their age isn't going to save them. And that's just like such a heavy realization to have as a kid, and even later on, you know, reading this again and understanding that in a completely different and deeper way, having it as an adult.
Yeah, in the aftermath of the bus thing, like I fully expected that to be like the inciting incident for like the rest of the book. I was just like waiting for this is going to start a bunch of dominoes falling where the Logans, if not the children themselves, then perhaps Papa or Mama are going to like suffer the direct consequences of this incident, whether or not anybody can prove that they did it, obviously. And you know, on the one hand, I was a little bit relieved when nothing worse happened, right? But on the other hand, that's just one of many such incidents throughout the book.
I felt throughout the whole experience of reading this book just this tightening in my chest and this dread about the horrible stuff that I figured was probably incoming.
I actually have a question. So, Brandon, did you also have that dread and that fear as you read it? What were your expectations, both of you? Like, did you have an idea of what you thought would happen, or just from like reading the back and knowing what it was about, or what were your expectations going into this book?
So for me, I didn't read like the back of the book or anything like that because I kind of wanted to go in as fresh as possible, mainly based upon things I read later in life that dealt with this sort of racism in this period. I was expecting it to kind of fit a similar mold of there's some sort of slice of life stuff and we get to see how they're living, how they're like just scraping by, how even poor white folks are better off than they are no matter how much they deserve that or not. And that eventually there would be some significant moment where one of the family, or possibly like Mr. Morrison or somebody, would be blamed for something that probably they didn't do. And, you know, hurt or killed or whatever the case may be. So I was kind of waiting for like that shoe to drop specifically. And of course it doesn't quite. There's no like singular moment of that other than perhaps TJ near the end.
How about you, Ren?
I also don't read the back of books, especially when it comes to books for this podcast that somebody else has picked out for me to read. I go in just not knowing anything about even the genre half the time. So I just had the cover, and the particular cover of the book that I have, because I saw that there are many different covers, but this is the one where she's sort of standing in front of a like billowing cloud with her arms crossed. Mm-hmm. It gave me nothing to go on. So I was like, okay, I see cotton. Maybe this is just going to be, you know, kind of a Little House on the Prairie, but, you know, different time period, slightly different time period. But then when they started talking about the burning, I started to get a little worried that I was in something deeper. Then after the bus, and the night of them panicking that they were going to get caught for it. Then when that sort of resolved, I was like, oh, okay, maybe I don't have to be quite so scared. This was just like a moment of panic, and then everything will go back to normal. And then everything just kept kind of snowballing and getting worse. So the dread just kept compounding. And Brandon is sort of right in that there was no like one huge thing, but I kind of feel like it was more about like the death of 1,000 paper cuts, really. Just like their entire existence is all these little things.
Yeah.
I felt like the end being ambiguous actually just made it more scary and just left me sitting there staring off into space for a few minutes like, oh gosh.
It's intense. It's funny. So I read this book with more fear and dread now than I ever did at 8, even though I know exactly what happens. I know who gets harmed, who does not. Like, I knew every plot point because this has embedded itself so hard in my brain that even not having read it for 20, maybe even as many as 30 years, I could still tell you pretty much beat for beat what will happen. But having a much better understanding of what could have happened made this book a much scarier read than it ever did as a kid. Seeing Cassie with her temper and knowing how easily it could get her in trouble. Like, we have that moment in the store in Strawberry where she doesn't understand why they're being made to wait when he's waiting on even just like a little white girl as opposed to the white adults that she could understand. Or when she knocks into Lily and Jean and doesn't apologize, and just all the times that her temper flares up in the direction of white folks and how dangerous that could be for her, how dangerous the boycott that her parents organized to go to shop at Vicksburg instead of, what is basically a company store only for plantation owners. Like, they do so many brave things, and every one of them just comes with a lump in your throat because there is no guarantee that this is going to turn out like, a movie where they do the right thing and therefore they're rewarded. And they're not, as we said, for organizing the boycott down in Vicksburg, Mama is fired. For getting some of their own back against the bus, the kids then have like a week where they live in fear that somebody's going to come and harm them. It's just over and over. You see all the things that they do and that happens to them, and there's just this dread, like Brandon called it, that it's just sitting there because you're waiting because you don't know how it's going to turn out. And I have noticed that I actually get the same feeling when I watch any movie or show about Black excellence that happens back at that time. Like, I think I was watching Hidden Figures, and through the whole movie, that was, about 3 incredibly brilliant Black women, I was waiting for someone to come and try to put them in their place, just like with brutality more than anything else. And again, they face microaggressions and segregated bathrooms and the difference between beads and pearls and all that. But I spent the whole movie waiting for disaster to strike, for violence to happen against them. And in this book, even knowing exactly what was going to happen, I still had that feeling, that expectation that at any moment violence could break out against them, because honestly, any moment it could have.
I recognized part of the way through the book that something had changed in me in the reading of this, where after the bus, I wrote that phone note about, I wish they didn't feel bad about, them doing something that was totally justified. And I was sort of like super rooting them on about doing the shoveling thing. And then when they got to the scene where their uncle was driving them through town, and there's this bridge where only one car can pass at a time. And it's sort of just known that if you're a Black person, you need to let the white people cross the bridge before you. You just need to be deferential. And Uncle Hammer decides to just pull over and drive through the bridge and ignore the fact that there's white people that we're about to cross. And instead of rooting him on, I was just like, no, 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 don't do it. Don't do it. No, 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 don't do it. Something terrible is going to happen if you do this.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so it went from me being like, yeah, do the revenge thing to being scared for them to do the revenge thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was anxious for a while about Uncle Hammer's car, just because there was such an emphasis on the fact that it was very much like Mr. Granger's car,
Yeah.
but a little newer. That was another moment where I was just like, this could, like, just this fact that he is driving around in this car could just make like the Wallaces or someone else just decide that they need to put Uncle Hammer in his place, right? So I was kind of waiting for that to possibly be another incendiary thing that also never quite came around, although some of the white folks definitely like make clear that they do not think that Uncle Hammer should have a car like that.
Yeah.
Just on principle.
Yeah, you can really just read in those interactions that these people think the fact that this, black man has this nice car is him being uppity.
It's a direct insult to them for him to have this thing. And I think both of your thoughts kind of meld together to show both like how tiny and minimal anything can be that would set somebody off. Whether it's having a nice car, not calling somebody Ms. or Mr., going across a bridge, any of these tiny things can set off, again, incredible violence. And Ren, you mentioned about how you were like, no, don't do it, turn around, which is exactly what I was thinking at the same time. But again, it's just, if this is what you're feeling reading a book, just imagine how much more it would be like living that, and how hard it was for any of these people to kind of stand up and do things like go across a bridge or organize a boycott, because, again, they have that fear, that knowing that any of this could be the spark that sets off an entire bomb, and then forcing themselves to do it anyway, because living with that fear strips them of their dignity, and their dignity is literally the only thing they have. And even that is kind of conditional, because, again, at any time somebody can come and do their best to strip it from them. So it's just, you really get a feeling of like how difficult it was, how much you don't want them to do these things, even as you're rooting for them to do these things, because you're scared of the consequences that could result. And the questions of like, if I were Black and living in 1933 Mississippi, would I have had the gumption to do these things? Would I bring my nice new car down from the north to Mississippi, where I know that they're going to take it as an insult? Would I have the temper? Would I let myself boycott? Or would I just take would I just kind of let things happen to keep myself and my family safe?
I obviously can't say how I would act, but I kind of assume that I would probably also just try to be invisible, because I recognize that a lot of the loud stuff that I'm able to do in my life in the current day is because I have the shield of being white. So, one of the most powerful things in the book that I thought was pretty important thing for me to read was on page 129. Jeremy is sort of the middle kid in the Sims family, which is largely a group of absolute racist jerks. But he tries to befriend Stacy and the others, and comes by on Christmas to give them a Christmas gift, and then he kind of like leaves. The mother gives this little speech about how, even if it seems like Jeremy is a friend right now, to kind of always be vigilant, because she says, white people may demand our respect, but what we give them is not respect but fear. what we give to our own people is far more important because it's given freely. And I think this might have been the first time in my life that I was able to really internalize as a white person how even with the allies and the nice ones, black people have to be guarded around us because they never know, when we're gonna not be nice anymore. And it was just a very impactful section.
Yeah. Papa also has a thing that he says, no, you could be right about Jeremy making a much finer friend than TJ ever will be. The trouble is, down here in Mississippi, it costs too much to find out. So I think you'd better not try. Again, yeah, that hits different now. And the first time I read it, I was very offended, actually, by that passage because, again, I'm mixed race. My father was white. I grew up in central Connecticut, so the vast majority of my friends were white. And, I would throw down in defense of the friendship and how much my dad loved me and all of this stuff. And I still would, to be clear. I'm married to a white man. Like there is not going to deny it. So this really kind of hurt my feelings when I read it. Like, how could you say that? But as you said, now reading it as an adult, understanding that gulf is so great that in 1933 Mississippi, it is very hard, if not impossible, to be bridged. Two things. There is another book in the series, novella. It's a short story. It's called The Friendship. And it's actually about a friendship between a black man. I don't remember his name. I'm going to have to search for it in a sec. And his friendship with Caleb Wallace, who's one of the Wallace brothers that we read a lot about in Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry as, one of the many horrific racist white people that the family has to watch out about. And Caleb and gosh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to find his name now. But Caleb and the black main character of this story were friends growing up. Oh, Mr. Tom B, that's who it is. And when they were young, they were friends. And Caleb, one big thing in that time in Mississippi is that all white people were addressed with an honorific. Like Lillian Jean, who is Jeremy's big sister, needs to be referred to as Ms. Lillian Jean, even though she's like maybe 13 or 14. And omitting that honorific when you talk to a white person isn't, as once again, grounds for violence. But Caleb told Tom when they were young that Tom would never, ever have to refer to him as Mr. Whatever because they were friends. And now they are adults, and Caleb has obviously kind of changed his stance on that. And oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't Caleb Wallace, it's John Wallace. Again, it's been a while, sorry everybody. And so at the very end, they have a confrontation. So Tom has just used John's first name. Thank you, John. Just put it on my charges there, John. Just put it on my charges. He glanced again at the men and started out. He got as far as the steps. The boys and I turned to go. Then we heard a click. The explosion of a shotgun followed by Mr. Tom B. tumbled down the steps, his right leg ripped open by the blast. And then we skipped a little. The white men came out and sniggered. Mr. John Wallace, carrying the shotgun, came out on the porch too. He'd stood there, his face solemn, and said, "You made me do that, Tom. I could have killed you, but I ain't wanting to kill you because you done saved my life, and I'm a Christian man, so I ain't forgetting that. But this here disrespecting me gotta stop, and I means to stop it now. You gotta keep in mind you ain't nothing but a nigger. You gotta learn to watch your mouth. You gotta learn to address me proper. You hear me, Tom?" Mr. Tom B. sat in silence, staring at the bloody leg. "Tom, you hear me?" Now, slowly, Mr. Tom B. raised his head and looked up at John Wallace. "Oh yeah, I hears you all right. I hears you. But let me tell you something, John. You was John to me when I saved your sorry life, and you gave me your word you was always going to be John to me as long as I lived. So you might as well go ahead and kill me, 'cause that's what you're gonna be, John. You hear me, John? Till the judgment day, till the earth opens itself up, and the fires of hell comes and takes your ungrateful soul. You hear me, John? You hear me? John, 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 till the judgment day, John. And with that, he raised himself to one elbow and began to drag himself down the road. Like, that is what Papa is thinking about when he says that you can't trust friendship made in childhood, that it costs too much to find out, because they have no guarantee that when Jeremy grows up, he's going to be anything other than Mr. John Wallace, going back on the friendships and the promises he made as a child, because he has realized where he stands in society, and to not insist on that respect and that decorum will lower himself in the eyes of the whites as well. Which again, we see in the form of Mr. Jameson, the lawyer, who helps out the families and ends up suffering for it. In Let the Circle Be Unbroken, we get more of what happened to TJ after his arrest, and Mr. Jameson is going to represent him, and there's going to be a trial, and because he is so firm on representing TJ and making sure there's a trial, his office is burned down, his dog is poisoned. Like, it's not just that this violence comes to Black people, it will also come to white folks who don't maintain that forcible racist separation. It's fear all the way down.
Jeez. Yeah, I didn't understand until you said that what the deal was with calling Lily what's her face?
Lillian Jean.
Miss Lillian Jean. I just didn't understand the honorifics thing. I thought it was just like a her thing or something.
Nope. That's why Cassie doesn't go and take her vengeance on Lillian Jean, which again I loved, until she had enough dirt that Lillian Jean wouldn't bring it up. Because so Lillian Jean, when they go to Strawberry right after Cassie has that terrifying encounter where she has the audacity to tug on the white shopkeep's shirt and kind of demand that he wait on them instead of waiting on this little white girl, he ends up, yelling at her, and Stacy makes her get out, like basically throws her out of the store for her own protection, but she doesn't understand. And she stumbles into Lillian Jean, and Lillian Jean pushes her and says she's got to walk in the gutter, and she's rude to Lillian Jean, including just calling her Lillian Jean. And Mr. Sims, Lillian Jean's father, twists her arm, this grown man twisting this 9-year-old girl's arm until she apologizes and refers to Lillian Jean as Ms. Lillian Jean. And after that, she comes up with a scheme where she befriends Lillian Jean and listens to her gossip and talk about this boy she likes and carries her books to school. And Lillian Jean is just like, well, of course she's doing that. Why wouldn't she? And then once Cassie has kind of enough dirt on Lillian Jean, she brings her into the woods and knocks her down and punches her a couple times and refers to her as Lillian Jean. And first Lillian's like, I'm going to tell my dad, which again, spark of violence. Cassie dared lay a hand on a white girl. And then Cassie basically has to blackmail her with, if you do that, I will tell everybody about this boy you like and the friends you're being, you're talking shit about. So it's only when Lillian Jean is afraid of what will happen to her that she backs off. And even after that, she's just so confused. She's like, Cassie, you were such a nice girl. What happened? Because she cannot comprehend that the disrespect that she gave to Cassie could possibly have any effect on Cassie at all. She doesn't get it.
Yeah, I thought that was really wild when she was just so completely dumbfounded about it, and I was like, are you kidding? How did you not know?
Do you guys remember the Central Park birdwatching incident in 2020?
Yeah.
So folks who might not, in 2020, there was Christian Cooper, who was a Black bird watcher And this unrelated white lady named Amy Cooper was walking a dog in part of Central Park. And Amy unleashed her dog, which was like against park rules. And Christian was like, "Hey, you need to leash your dog." And she refused. And I guess Christian like tried to get the dog to come to her because it was just running wild off the leash. And she yelled, "Don't you touch my dog." And then Christian started recording Amy while Amy placed a call to 911 yelling, "There is an African-American man. I'm in Central Park. He's recording me and threatening me. And please send the cops immediately." And Amy Cooper's whole thing is built on the same thing that this book is about. The idea that Black men are inherently dangerous to white women. And she's calling the police, who now take the position of the lynch mobs that you get in Emmett Till, that you got in the book with the burning, because she's just playing right into that narrative, which is why she starts off with, "There is an African-American man, and he's threatening me." And so Christian was very lucky that he was recording and that video went viral, so they could see exactly what happened and how he wasn't threatening Amy. And things could have gone very, very differently. There's the Central Park 5 in the 80s where Donald Trump, shockingly, put out like a full-page ad saying that they were guilty and needed to face like the ultimate punishment. Because again, they were young Black men and they got arrested for potentially threatening a white woman, which again didn't happen. But we're still seeing the echoes of the same exact behavior: the threatening white man, the threatening Black man, the vulnerable white woman, and the immediate media and official outcry of calling him a danger. It's all built on the same exact stuff that you read about in 1933 Mississippi.
Yeah.
Yeah, that gets a little bit. We talked about Little Man a bit earlier, and how Little Man is one sort of lens into learning the way that 1930s Mississippi works, and also, of course, about Cassie and her learning that people aren't just jerks, they're racist. And though it was like maybe less than those two, we also got, I think, that shift in the book at a certain point where clearly Stacy has started to understand, as he's like, what, 12?
Mm-hmm.
That as a 12-year-old Black boy, he is entering into that phase where white folks are going to see him as inherently threatening on some level. And Cassie doesn't get a lot of that,
Mm-hmm.
especially because like I think it largely sort of happens off screen when Stacy starts to go places with Papa and Mr. Morrison and Uncle Hammer at points. But like we can kind of glimpse Stacy processing this to some degree, and he's just not sharing it with Cassie much. But I thought that was very notable once I kind of realized it was happening.
Yeah.
I definitely picked up a lot on Stacy's experience there. I did want to give just like a little bit of a call out to the third child, Christopher John, because I feel like he didn't have as big a role as the other three kids and how they were dealing with everything. But I thought the way that he was dealing with things was very interesting, where he was the one that always wanted to just follow the rules
Mm-hmm.
and not get in trouble that way. So it's sort of like four different ways of dealing with all this stuff that were being highlighted here, which I thought was really interesting. But you're right that Stacy's experience was highlighted pretty well.
Do we want to talk about TJ? Because like the last third of the book is really TJ's story, just through the lens of Cassie. So in the book, TJ and Stacy have a huge falling out. TJ is the reason that Mr. Granger comes to the school and fires Mama. He's so mad about not being able to cheat on a big test that he goes to the Wallace store and complains about her and talks about like how she covered up the inside of the books where it talks about how like all the white people, and then once it's very poor it goes to Negras, and just bitch, talk shit about mama in front of the white people. And the white folks, who are already mad at her for starting the boycott, decide to do something about it. So they send Mr. Granger and I think a couple other members of the Board of Ed or something to sit in on one of Mama's classes, and that leads to her getting fired. And Stacy's just like, you got my mom fired? We can't be friends anymore. And so TJ ends up making friends with Jeremy and Lily and Jean's older brothers, RW and Melvin. And they treat him so good. They buy him clothes. They let him call them RW and Melvin, no misters, which is something that he brags about, and tries to rub it in everybody's face. They bring him places. They let him ride in their truck. And he really believes that they are friends. And even though, but like RW and Melvin throughout this whole thing, they're laughing at him at how he could believe that, how he could be so stupid. And in the towards the end of the book, they promise to get TJ this beautiful pearl-handled pistol that he has wanted since the very beginning of the book. So they drive into Strawberry and they go to the same general store that Cassie had that trouble in, and it's closed. And TJ's like, well, I guess we'll come back tomorrow. And they're like, no. Well, you go in. There's a window that you're skinny enough to go into. Let us in. We'll take it. And if anybody comes down, we'll just tell them that we needed it tonight and we were going to come in on Monday and pay. It'll be fine. And TJ, being an idiot, believes this. So he shimmies in through the window, goes in, unlocks the door for RW and Melvin to come in, and he sees that they come in wearing black pantyhose over their faces and hands, and they get him the pearl-handled pistol, and then they go in and start bashing against the lock to get to the lockbox that has all of the money. And the shopkeeper and his wife hear the noise, and they come downstairs, and there's a scuffle, and one of RW and Melvin, like, they push the wife over and she bangs her head, and they hit the shopkeep with the blunt end of an axe, and he goes down and he ends up dying. And TJ's like, this is way more than I had signed up for. This is bad. And so he's just like, no, I'm gonna tell. Like, this has gone way too far. And RW and Melvin beat him to the point where, like, his ribs are broken. And then they go off to a pool hall after, like, they hadn't just robbed, killed, and beaten several people. TJ ends up getting a ride home with a farmer, and he ends up going to Stacy because Stacy, he's like, Stacy's the only person who can help me. And Stacy and the rest of the kids, they hear TJ's story, and they help him home, and he gets in through the window because he was, his mother was like, if you stay out of the house overnight again, I'm kicking you out. So he's like, I gotta get in. I'll just sneak into the window and pretend I've been in my bed all night. And they help him in, and that's when a lynch mob shows up, because RW and Melvin were like, yeah, no, we saw 3 black kids running with the lockbox. One of them was TJ, who we recognize because we've been hanging out with him. And this lynch mob comes to literally murder TJ. They go into the house, they drag all of the family out, including the children, who several of them are preschool age. They tear through his TJ's room. They find the pearl-handled pistol because, again, TJ's an idiot and didn't throw it away. And that's enough evidence. They literally start talking about not only lynching TJ, but somebody has a great idea. Yeah, and since we're so close, we'll just go down to the Logan land and get Papa and Mr. Morrison too. We'll string all of them up. And again, Cassie and her brothers are like right in the tree line seeing and hearing all of this. And Stacy tells the little kids to go, and they run home, and they warn their dad, and the first thing that Papa does is go and grab a gun, and Mama is just like, no, you cannot do this with a gun. And he's like, we have to go save TJ. And she's like, you can't do it with a gun. If you bring a gun there, they will kill you. And so you have to find another way. And it's storming out. It's not yet raining, but there's thunder and lightning. And what happens is that Papa goes out and sets literally a quarter of his cotton fields on fire. And Mr. Granger is just like, forget lynching anybody. That fire is spreading towards my land. Everybody's, come over here and you have to help me save it. And since Mr. Granger is the premier landowner in their town, everybody listens to him. And so TJ, Mr. Jameson, a white lawyer, the white lawyer who's going to help him, he had shown up, and he is allowed to take TJ, to put TJ in custody with the sheriff, who had been amongst the lynch mob, to be clear. And TJ ends up getting taken to jail, which is way better of an outcome than getting lynched right in his front yard in front of his family and friends. So this is kind of the whole last third of the book, is watching TJ break, what Papa had said to Stacy in befriending white people, and just this slow yet fast roller coaster descent into crime and murder and his own victimization. So that's kind of what happened there. How did you all feel reading that? What was your headset as you're reading this? Or mindset?
That was complicated. Because TJ is awful.
Yeah.
He's just constantly a manipulative little shit towards Stacy in particular. He does the whole thing where he talks Stacy out of his new coat. And I was just like, I had that sort of sensation that I was like, I hope this character sort of gets some kind of comeuppance, right? Mm-hmm. Because he's just constantly taking advantage of the people around him and letting other people take the fall for things he does, like when he lets Mama believe that Stacy is the one who snuck cheat notes into the test or whatever. Mm-hmm. But of course, once it all started to go the way that it went, I had that very much oh, no, not like that, no. I just wanted him to look stupid or something. Or for the story to end at that moment where he's before they go to the store, he's bragging about his friendship, quote unquote, with RW and Melvin, and Stacy is very much nope, you're not my friend anymore, TJ. Go away. And there's that moment where TJ kind of stares after Stacy and the other Logan kids with that moment of perhaps realization that he has lost something valuable. Mm-hmm. There. If that was, I was fine with that. I was good. Screw you, TJ. But yeah, once all of that started to unravel, it's not that is not a thing that I would want to happen to anyone, really. But it definitely was not. Yeah, I feel like the book definitely did some things like this where there's that mix of a thing that feels a little bit cathartic, at least observing in a audience of a story fashion, with the presence of, or at least the risk of, horrific consequences.
Yeah, that all, because Cassie even says that she has sort of a weird, conflicting bunch of emotions about feeling bad for TJ, even though, he's done awful stuff to her and her family, or mostly her family. I think the thing that stuck out to me amidst all of that was where Mama was trying to tell Papa not to take the gun, and how, him showing up to that situation with a gun was just going to get him killed. And that's still relevant. Mm-hmm. That's still an issue to this day. If a Black person has a gun, they're in danger. Even if a gun is ostensibly for, self-protection, it puts a target on you. It was, 1933 is not particularly different than 2023. in a great many ways.
Yeah. And it really kind of puts the myth of the only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, because, Papa is trying to go out, save his own life and save the life of a literal child. Again, Stacy and TJ, they're 14, not 12, but they're 14 years old. That is not old enough to be like, well, I mean, no age is old enough to be lynched. That's not a thing. But again, literal children. But Black children, especially young Black men, aren't really allowed to have a childhood in the same way. But it's just like, but regardless, Papa is the American definition of a good guy with a gun. He is trying to protect his family. He's trying to protect a child that did his family wrong, but it doesn't matter. He is still a child. And if he had gone out there with a gun, literally all that would have occurred is even more violence. He would have been bringing violence down on himself. And even if the lynch mob had come for him and Mr. Morrison, they probably would have left Big Mama, and the kids alone. If he went out there with a gun, everybody would have been targeted. So it's just, again, that rhetoric, that belief, that just shows that, I mean, it's never actually real, but how very white-centric that belief is, because as you said, if it is a Black man with a gun, the assumption is never that he is the good guy. And it may have been more egregious in 1933 with, again, a literal lynch mob, but then we look at police violence, and the egregiousness starts to really, like, fade away. Like, no, not tarred and feathered, but beaten or knelt on. And you see, as you said, we're 90 years past what Cassie is going through. And while we have made incredible strides, there is still a lot of that violence and racism under the surface, or not really under the surface anymore. And you can just see it in so many different aspects of the way that society and the media interact with Blackness.
Yeah, if this story was about a, poor white family in rural Mississippi in the 30s, it absolutely would have probably ended with, a bit of a shootout, maybe some asshole or two actually dying, and then everybody being like, okay, let's leave them alone. Because they shoot guns good. And we would all applaud and be like, yeah, that's the way it is. You protect your own. That's the American way, I guess. But it absolutely couldn't happen that way.
Yep. A lot of what makes up the American dream and the American myth is solidly contained just to white people. It's not the same. Like, again, Manifest Destiny and the Homesteading Acts, those were specifically for white people. Black people, Native folks, Mexicans need not apply. So all of it has always just been in the hands of whites, but we still have this idea that, no, it's for everybody, and that's not true. In the sequel, Let the Circle Be Unbroken, we do find out what happens to TJ. I don't know if you guys want spoilers for that, but another main plot point is Cassie and Mama helping this woman learn about the Mississippi Constitution because she wants to vote. And in this time period, there were several things that you had to do to be eligible to vote, one of which was pay your poll taxes, which you did not have to do if your grandfather was allowed to vote, which is where we get the clause grandfathered in. So if your grandfather was allowed to vote, at this time, the only people whose grandfathers could have voted were white men, because, this is like I believe Cassie's dad was born into slavery as well. Like, he was 2 years old when the Civil War happened. So obviously everybody's grandfathers were firmly in the time where before the amendment that allowed Black men to vote. So if your grandfather couldn't, you had to pay a poll tax. And you also had to take a test. And the tests were horrifically unfair. At one point, one of the tests that they mentioned in the book was somebody pulled out a jar of jelly beans and was like, how many jelly beans are in this jar? Oh, you guessed wrong. You can't vote. And if you look up historical records of what those tests were, they were written specifically to be impossible, because you definitely should. They were just, even today with a college education, you can't parse what they're asking for, and that's deliberate. But this woman goes and her poll taxes are paid, and she goes to take the test to vote. And even though she has studied and can recite various parts of the Mississippi Constitution, she loses the vote. And then Mr. Granger, who found her here, and she's a sharecropper on his land, they in fact ask, who do you belong to? As in, whose land do you sharecrop on? And she replies, Mr. Granger's, so they go and fetch him. And there's all this other stuff that's happening with unions and everything else. And at the end of it, Harlan Granger hops into his car and looks at not only the old woman who had voted, but also her younger relation who had brought her here, and looks at them both, and he's like, I want y'all's off my land by tomorrow morning. For the audacity of trying to vote. Again, you have now been evicted. Take all of your families, all of your belongings. Figure out what you're doing.
Jesus.
Yep. If Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry is a great book that introduces you to a lot of the concepts, a lot of the ideas of institutional racism, and kind of the violence that you can see outside of the law. Let the Circle Be Unbroken is a really good look at the way that the different laws were written to allow so much institutional racism, because it shows all the specific channels, how it can take form in all these different, completely legal and political channels. Again, it's a great read. It's especially a good read if you like to cry. Like, if you're here for crying, it's a good book.
I wanted to touch on one other thing which I thought really mirrored current events before we go into background information about the book. And that was, we talked about it for a moment, the scene where Mr. Granger and some of the school board comes in to sit in on what Mama's teaching. And that immediately made me think of the whole debate about CRT and stuff right now. And then it made me think, oh my gosh, I bet this is one of the books that people want to ban.
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't want people knowing about the actual history of this stuff. And sure enough, it's frequently on the challenged list for potential banning.
Oh yeah, I have to imagine that it's always been in that state for sure.
They try to, censor what people can teach then, and still happening.
Mm-hmm.
That stuck out to me.
So I just pulled up kind of like some of the banned book lists, and I'm actually seeing now that through my school system, we actually read a fair number of books like this. We read To Kill a Mockingbird, which is, it does have that white lens because Scout is white, but it does have that very great courtroom scene. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, I read in high school. To Kill a Mockingbird, I read in 6th grade. Huck Finn, I read in high school. The K, which again had an old black man and a young white boy who have been deserted on an island, and the young white boy is blind from an injury and needs the black man to take care of him, and he starts very racist, and then as he goes on, he's like, oh, this black guy's also a human. Who knew? And then at the end, they return to white racist society. Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. So actually, apparently, my school system had a decent number of books that do explore racism. We also had Scott Dell's Island of the Blue Dolphins, which at least touched on what happened to the indigenous population. So, all right, shout out to Plainville, Connecticut for apparently having a very woke book list in their elementary their public school systems before being woke was cool. Good job, tiny Connecticut town. Proud of you.
I'm gonna say I'm surprised
Yeah.
because my very my view of Connecticut is not particularly friendly
That's fair. Neither's mine.
in general. It's a very affluent white place that I just assumed would not be particularly progressive
Yeah.
in that way.
No, hard same.
Yeah, we did read To Kill a Mockingbird, but it wasn't until high school. And I think maybe that like the kind of trial plot is maybe the thing I was sort of expecting to eventually crop up when I was starting into this book.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, definitely not much else. I do think I feel like I remember Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, among others, probably also the K, maybe. Just being like featured on like posters and stuff the library would have up of like, like Newbery Award winners or something like that, right? So they maybe existed, but they weren't being assigned, and I was a stupid child. And if I wasn't specifically assigned to read a book or knew like what the book was about because maybe it was a part of a series that I had experience with or something at that point, I put a lot of stock into titles.
Mm-hmm.
And so I very seldom read books that were named after people unless their names were really cool or interesting. I mostly read books that the titles were either something that sounded like an interesting plot point or like maybe an item or something that sounded engaging enough, right? So I feel almost certain that I at some point became aware that Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry was a book. I didn't look into it any further because I was like, I don't care about storms.
Oh no.
That doesn't sound interesting.
That's kind of my experience with Island of the Blue Dolphins. I was like, I don't like dolphins. Moving on. So I've never read that.
Well, we kind of got down this route talking about banned book lists, but do we want to circle back and have any background notes? No, we haven't talked about like the author, for example.
This was written in 1977. The author herself, Mildred. I'm very not good with French looking words often. Let's see. Mildred DeLuise?
That sounds good.
Mildred DeLuise Taylor. And she was born in 1943 in Mississippi. So, this is a familiar geographical region to her at the very least, even though she was born 10 years after the events of this took place. Like Nuance already said, it's a sequel. And it won the 1977 Newbery Medal. When did you say the most recent one came out of this series? You said like 2004, I think?
2020.
2020! Holy moly.
So actually, let me rephrase. So it is her most recently published book. I think All the Days Past and All the Days to Come is included in my version. I'll have to check. So definitely The Land, which I know, which is actually the prequel to Song of the Trees and Roll of Thunder, was published in 2001. Let me just check to see if this is also... Oh, yep. It's the conclusion of the Logan story.
I was surprised, although I shouldn't have been, that there's only ever been one film adaptation of this, back in 1978. It hasn't been adapted beyond that, and that's absurd.
This would be a great book to adapt in the right hands.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like instant movieable piece of media. I don't understand. Someone needs to get on that.
But it's definitely one that needs a Black director. I mentioned Hidden Figures as a movie that had concerned me greatly, waiting for violence to happen. But the end of the movie, I'm just spoilering everything for people, I'm sorry. The end of the movie, after she has been brought in so she can do all of the calculations to make sure that the launch goes off okay. In the movie, she leaves, and then to go back down. The door's closed on her, and she just stands there for a moment, and you're like, everything she's done, she's still not allowed in the room where it happens. And then in the movie, the door opens, and what's-his-face holds his hand out to her, and she's brought in. But that isn't what happened. Historically, she did everything that happened in the movie. She made those calculations, and then she was pushed out of the room, and she was sent back downstairs in with the black calculus pool, and she listened to it on the radio. And it feels so good in the movie theater when you're watching it, and your heart is breaking, and the door opens, and she's brought in, and you're like, yes, it's cathartic, it's good. But that isn't what happened. And so we get this happy ending where, again, the white guy comes in and saves the day and brings her in, and he didn't do that. And I would be furious if Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry ends with, like, TJ getting away, or I'd be furious with this happy ending, because the book itself ends with the phrase, I cried for TJ. I cried for TJ and the land. And you need to have that happen. And if somebody were to come in and just, like, whitewash it up and give it a happy ending, I might set something on fire. I would definitely flip a table.
Was the Hidden Figures movie directed by a white person?
Yeah, Theodore Melfi. He's of Italian descent. In the Green Book, this is not that podcast. Sorry.
Yeah, during the end of the book, I was kind of idly thinking, oh, this whole everyone trying to put out the fire thing, if this were just sort of like made by a big Hollywood studio for the most mass audience that they could get, this would be a moment where everybody is like, but we're all actually a community and we're going to help each other, not totally like let everything burn down. And we'll realize that we're not that different, actually. And I don't want to see that version.
Yeah. And again, there is a plot point in Let the Circle Be Unbroken, where they're trying to start a union. Some folks come down and they're trying to start a union. And they're like, it's going to be an integrated union because white folks and black folks, if we try to keep it to segregated and only one race, we're not going to have enough people to make it important. And at the same time that Aunt Letty is trying to vote, the union comes in with this whole integrated kind of parade of people who have lost their land and their farms and have been kicked off a sharecropping land. And it's just this huge parade, and they pull into the courthouse and they're like, we want our due, we want justice. And Mr. Granger, the worst person in the world, comes out and he makes a speech. And the speech is, oh, so y'all are interested in integrated marrying and schooling and all this stuff to drive a wedge. And the white union guy, he's like, no, we're not talking about any of that. That's not what's happening here. We're integrated for this specific thing, but people don't listen. And Mr. Granger manages to break up not only a union, a union demonstration, but the union itself, because he's able to just ply on those racist fears and internal beliefs. So again, if you have there's that happy ending where we're all a community, except that doesn't happen in that book, and it explicitly is undermined in the next book, because there's never that idea of we are one community. It is always we are separate. We cannot be together. And like you said, if we get anything else, it's just it rings hollow. It is inauthentic.
This episode is not going to come out for a while, but I feel like it's probably fairly pertinent to point out that we are recording this episode about a week after everything sucks. About a week after Tennessee just got rid of marriage equality, including interracial marriage.
Yep.
So everything's really raw, and the book is always timely, no matter what.
Mhm. How does this fit in with your conceptualization of the Deep South in this time period? Did it change anything? Did it highlight anything? Do you feel like you learned more? You have a better understanding? Or is this still just like, yeah, this is pretty much what I expected. It's the Deep South. It's 1933. Like, how did this affect your understanding, if at all?
I I think it gave me more perspective to be able to sort of visualize just a little bit more, even though I acknowledge that I will not ever really know what it's like. And it is really about what I expected for, you know, that time period. I guess I want to point out that I'm from incredibly rural Maine, and so I think that we often get this perspective of it's just bad in the South with the media that we take in, and I think that this story could have also happened in the area that I grew up in. It wouldn't have surprised me had this happened geographically anywhere in America, I guess is what I'm saying, because I don't, because of where I'm from, I don't have this illusion that it was only ever bad in the South.
Can I actually hop on that with a personal anecdote?
Sure.
So I know I mentioned about how I faced like racial slurs and everything, not really violence, but actually in my family tree. So my great my great great grandfather was a black stable hand for an affluent and prominent white family. And the daughter of this prominent and affluent white family ended up pregnant out of wedlock, knocked up by a black stable hand. And he vanished. And we do not know whether he ran for his own safety or if he's somewhere in a shallow grave. And we have like 50-50 odds on which one it is. And again, that's in Connecticut. My family's been there for generations, but that is in Connecticut. And it was the 18 my great grandfather was born in 1898. So this happened in 1897, but it happened in the enlightened North. And the daughter was allowed to raise her son, my great grandfather John, and she was allowed to raise him until he was about 4, and then his skin he started kind of darkening up, which is how my grandfather described it. But his mixed race heritage started to really show, and the child was taken from her and given to his aunt, who had also been working for that family as a cook. And she was told to raise him now that they could no longer deny that he was half black. So you're exactly correct that this could happen anywhere because it happened in Connecticut in a probably at least a suburban area. So it definitely could have happened anywhere else.
Well, I can answer this question also. Factually speaking, this is pretty much the perception I had of the Deep South in this time period. Even though I didn't really have that context when I was, in grade school, or at least, younger grade school. As I got older, I not only was exposed to people who would not necessarily just recite the Virginia SOLs to me, but also just got more interested in history myself. And then especially like as I have gotten older and as I went to college and learned how kind of skewed some of my earlier education had been and things like that, like I have a pretty solid like picture, I think, of the facts of this era in history in this part of the country. But I do think that this book has been, I guess, the most powerful thing I've encountered in terms of giving me, a person who has never experienced systemic racism or discrimination myself, a little bit of a glimpse into what living in this place and time is like, right, in the small way that it can. So yeah, I think academically pretty much what I expected, but emotionally I think presented a lot of insight that I have not encountered before.
Yeah, that's a more eloquent way of how I feel.
How does the depiction of agriculture kind of affect the various characters, white and black?
I wanted to jump on this because I found that aspect of things incredibly interesting. Horrible, but interesting. Because there's a section where Granger is threatening them about how, maybe the price of cotton will change. Just, maybe randomly. And it made me realize that even them having the land and having this farm is threatened by the fact that white people control the prices and all of the credit systems, and everything is just incredibly precarious and balanced on just the good mood of these white people that control the entire agricultural system.
Mm-hmm.
And in a very, very small amount of space, they really showed that incredibly effectively.
Yeah, I agree with what Rin said. Yeah, I don't feel like I have anything like super insightful to say to this particular question.
Brandon's always much better at vocalizing things that have to do with like emotions and things. And I glom onto silly details about minutia and day-to-day life.
I mean, I don't think they're silly details, and I also glom onto minutia, just stupider minutia.
I'm pretty sure neither of you glom on stupider minutia. For one thing, if it's in a book, it's generally important. So I'm an English major. Ha, I win.
Oh.
Well,
I'm outnumbered.
I am also an English major.
Oh no, let's go. Let's do this.
Yeah.
All right, you two can have the podcast. I'll take my ecology major and run away.
And again, something they get more into. Ren, I really think you would love Let the Circle Be Unbroken because it is so grounded in history. They talk about how, like, in the late 20s, cotton was up to, I think, like 20, 30 cents a bale, maybe. I forget how much, but it was good times. And then the Depression hit, and it went all the way down to 6 cents. And now the government is trying to say how much people can and cannot plant to try to keep the market from getting glutted. At the same time, we've also started importing Egyptian cotton, which is considered a higher quality cotton. So it's just how the way the market affects everybody, the way, you expect living on a farm that even if they're struggling for money to pay the bills or their mortgage, they'd at least, be set as far as food goes. And you find out, yeah, they have a kitchen garden and that helps, but all the available land that they have pretty much is sent to cotton, which is a crop that does not benefit them as people. Its only use is to be sold. So just that interplay I find is fascinating.
There's also a thing that I guess I found slightly timely or timeless, maybe. I'm not sure. How the Logans have relatively little land, but they value it very much. They really value what they've got and put a lot of stock into the fact that they have it and it's theirs. And Mr. Granger has a bajillion acres, and he just wants more of it. Like, what's he going to do with it? And I'm like, I guess rich folks always suck.
And one of the things they bring out is it's Mr. Granger. His grandmother filled him up with ideas about the idyllic pre-Civil War South when all the land belonged to them. And during Reconstruction, the family had to sell off, I think, like 1,000 acres. And Cassie's grandfather bought 200 acres. And then Mr. Jameson's father bought a whole bunch more. And after they paid off the first 200 acres, the elder Mr. Jameson was starting to sell off his land, and he sold them 200 more acres, and the rest went to Mr. Granger. And Mr. Granger just sees those 400 acres that don't belong to him, but they used to belong to that family in the good old days. And to make matters worse, they belong to a black family. That just kills him inside. And, on the one hand, yay, good, you deserve it. But it's just like he uses every trick in the book that he can think of, trying to play on what he assumes their ignorance will be to get that land back. And it's just like, it kills him inside. Which, yay, good. But as you were saying, an extra 400 acres isn't going to change his life at all.
Yeah, it's such a small fraction of what he has already.
Mm-hmm. So it's purely spite. It's like spite in that idea of the glorious Golden South where everything was great until the Civil War.
And I still know people who are kind of raised like that, sadly. Generations later. One side of my family, I'm not going to go too far into this, but one side of my family who my parents have basically not associated with since I was very, very young, and I'm sure this is why, has and values exceptionally our Confederate ancestry. So Granger, particularly in that regard, kind of hit me like, oh, I sort of know people that are like this, or at least know people who are like this but don't have money, who have generationally been fed this increasingly mythic story of what stuff was like in, before the Civil War, and they just won't let that go. And so we don't talk to them.
An interesting detail in the book that gets less than a line is talking about how as they pass the Jefferson Davis School, the flags, the top flag is the Mississippi state flag. The second flag is the United States flag, which is by the flag code illegal. The United States flag is supposed to be on top. And that just kind of goes to show exactly their mindset and who they are. They are loyal to Mississippi before they are loyal to the U.S. And the idea that this state and the state's history and the Confederacy matter way more than the U.S. as a whole.
Well, and the school is named after the president of the Confederacy, Yep. So clearly important to them.
I had to go back and double check because I thought I remembered them saying, and they did, that the state flag had the emblem of the Confederacy on it.
Yep, up in the corner.
Yeah.
Gross. Well, we are pivoting pretty heavily from this book to our next read, which is going to be a Brandon pick.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not the same subject matter at all. Anyhow, we might find that it still depresses us to talk about, albeit probably not to the same degree. It depends on how much I remember it clearly and how fascist it is. But I think it's time that I have to sadly pop the cork on my military sci-fi phase, which comes with lots of authors who are problematic white men. And we're going to go with Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. I haven't read it for a long, long time. It might not be as problematic as my brain thinks it is, but I'm not gonna hold my breath, honestly.
We're gonna have to do a pie chart or something once we get to maybe episode 25 or something about how many of these books that we read as kids ended up having horribly problematic authors.
Ender's Game.
As a kid who read mostly sci-fi, I feel like every big name in at least mid 20th century sci-fi was a problematic white dude, right? To varying degrees. Actually, I don't know much about Clark. Maybe he wasn't.
Well, we'll find out.
but maybe I just don't know.
Again, thank you so much, Nuance, for joining us. Do you have anything that you want to pitch or tell people where they can find you on social media or anything like that?
You can find me at Shadowraven, SHADOWRAVYN, because I picked that name back in high school in my 30-second Wiccan phase, and it's just lingered. Where I talk a lot about racism, modern politics, transphobia, Sailor Moon, TTRPGs. It's a mixed bag of content. I do have a fairly unused Twitch channel. That's twitch.tv /BooksomeWench, BOOKSOMEWENCH.
That has the best name. My Dog Ate My Book Report is hosted and produced by Ren and Brandon and edited by Derek Valen and Daisy McNamara.
The music used in this podcast was licensed by Epidemic Sound. Transcripts are generated by otter.ai. Our icon image was illustrated by Cindy Lau.
Have a question or comment for the team?
You can find us on our website, which links to all of our socials at dogatemybookreport.blueberry.net. Blueberry has no E's. Or by emailing at dogatemybookreport@gmail.com.
We would be super excited to know what books you loved growing up. And I'm just going to leave it there because this episode's already too long.
Yeah.
I'm going to make it just like 5 seconds longer. This is actually the first poem I ever memorized.
Oh, nice.
So, it is a spiritual. I don't know the tune or anything, but roll of thunder, hear my cry, over the water by and by, old man coming down the line, whip in hand to beat me down, but I ain't gonna let him turn me around.